Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight my topic is on autonomous weapons and the role of law. And I'll be giving now a very brief outline of why I'm discussing these topics. Certainly we're going to be talking about autonomous weapons and their development, and we're going to contrast them with automatic weapons. But what I'm finding in this debate with the emergence of this weapons system is we're having to look at law and its interpretation and its role in a new way. In a way that discloses, in my view, a number of assumptions about its application and interpretation that usually lie hidden or understated. The emergence of autonomous weapon systems is acting as a trigger for many of us to look at some of these assumptions that underpin the law, and I'm going to be disclosing those tonight. So it is about autonomous weapons. You haven't been fooled. This is what we're going to be talking about. But I also have a sub-agenda to talk more generally about the role of law. We are talking about it because technology is developing this weapons system at an exponential rate, and we will have to deal with them. Do we have autonomous weapon systems today? The answer is no. Will we have them tomorrow? The answer is probably yes. And so we need to understand the legal framework that applies to them. So what am I talking about tonight? I am not talking about automatic weapons, automatic versus autonomous weapons. We have automatic weapons. Here is an automatic weapon. The Phalanx CWIS defence close-in weapon support system, that exists. That's on ships of navies around the world. It is not an autonomous weapon system because it applies by virtue of criteria of parameters that have been set already. So when a missile or anything fast is coming into a ship at Mach 2, this system will or can, in its semi-automatic mode, I should say, rise up and engage that weapon system. And that hasn't caused any great problems. Because it operates according to a defined set of criteria. As a matter of law, it's acting in self-defence of the ship. Anything coming into the ship at Mach 2, you will need to defend against. And so traditionally, this has not caused any great concern for the law or for the debate that's unfolding. Similarly, on the land context, we have the CRAM, or counter-rocket artillery and mortar system, a land version of the Phalanx CWIS system. If there's incoming rockets or mortars or artillery, then this system is activated according to a set of pre-programmed criteria to engage any incoming missile. And over the years, it is developing a great success rate. Israel uses such a system in the Iron Dome defence system, and it has a remarkable success rate in intercepting incoming artillery rockets and so on. This is not what we're talking about tonight. These are automatic systems, sort of a, if you like, a if-then. If this happens, then this response. What we're talking about is something different. What we're talking about tonight is autonomous weapon systems, and here are some definitions. There is no standard definition anywhere, so this is what some of the literature defines as autonomous weapon systems. A weapon system that, once activated, can select and engage targets without further intervention by a human operator. Or this one, a sophisticated combination of sensors and software that can learn or adapt their functioning in response to changing circumstances. It's an area that's closely related to the development of artificial intelligence, and from a military decision-making process, the idea is to get on top of your OODA loop, your observe, orient, decide and act loop, faster than your enemy can in order to react more successfully. So this is some of the definitions that are coming out in the literature. There are a number of semi-official definitions of autonomous weapon systems. The US Air Force has such a designation. A number of other countries do as well. My problem with these designations is that they go on forever. You'll have 9 to 15 categories and subcategories of what an autonomous weapon system is, and I always get confused about halfway down the line when I'm reading through these systems. I like this one. This comes out of NATO a few years ago, dealing with, in this instance, they were dealing with maritime autonomous weapons, but it could apply anywhere. And they came up with 4 levels. Level 1, a remotely controlled system, a system that, like a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle, or a drone as people refer to them, completely dependent on human action and interaction. acts according to human command processes. It's a dumb weapon in that it doesn't learn anything, it just responds completely to human action or reaction. Level 2 is what we saw with the Phalanx CWIS system, an automated system. Reactions and behaviour depend on built-in functionality, if then. As I say, more like an automatic weapon than an autonomous weapon. Level 3, though, we get into a new realm, a realm where weapons haven't yet reached. Autonomous non-learning. Behaviour depends upon fixed built-in functionality or upon fixed set of rules that dictate the system behaviour. And then finally, what I think many of us anticipate or imagine when we talk about autonomous weapons, the Terminator type weapon system, if you like, is this level 4. Autonomous, self-learning system. Behaviour depends on a set of rules that can be modified for continuously improving goal-directed reactions and behaviours with an overarching set of inviolate rules and behaviours. A system that acts independently, autonomously, can learn, can self-learn, and can react accordingly. That is what I am focusing on in this particular presentation tonight. Associated with this debate is a sub-debate about the role of human or humanity in command decision-making. And there's been, through this debate, there's been three designators, if you like, about the role humans have with machines. The first one is human in the loop. That is, machines that can select targets and deliver force only upon human command. And that we have now. Humans will dictate when the machine will fire or the weapon system will fire and are completely in control. We have humans on the loop, not in the loop, but on the loop. So the machine itself will acquire a target that will react as if it was going to fire on that target, but a human can override that. A human can veto that decision. So that's human on the loop. What I'm talking about tonight, potentially, hypothetically, is the last one, human outside the loop. Machines that can select a target and deliver force without human command or temporal oversight. So the level 4 designation of autonomous self-learning without human oversight or command. So you release it into the wild and off it goes to do what it is it's designed to do. So, are we there yet? No, we're not there yet, but we are on the way. Here is the SGR-A1, built by Samsung. So Samsung build phones and laptops and machines that can kill you. And here is one. This is a machine, it's in testing mode. It is completely controlled by human interaction. And this is a machine designed to be placed at the border between North and South Korea, which operates by way of infrared or visible light mechanisms, and it can engage human targets at the moment on command, but the idea might be in the future that it can autonomously react to stimulus for those that are wishing to invade South Korea, I suppose. Here's another one that's in development, the Tyrannus project, developed out of the UK. And this is known as the Raptor. This is it's a prototype that has been tested. And the design goal of the Tyrannus is this. It has 2 internal weapon bays intended to incorporate full autonomy, allowing it to operate without human control for a large part of its mission. Tyrannus is designed to fly intercontinental missions and carry a variety of weapons, enabling it to attack both aerial and ground targets. Designed to strike distant targets even in another continent, utilises stealth technology and gives a low radar profile. So this is the future. The British say that this may be operational by about 2030. So this is what I am talking about tonight, these sorts of weapon systems. So, are these weapon systems good? Are these weapon systems going to comply with the law of armed conflict? Are they going to preserve humanitarian priorities? Well, the opinion is divided. Certainly there are some out there that want these weapon systems banned now. They don't want any development, they don't want any planning, they want a preemptive ban on the development of these weapon systems. But then there are other voices, and here is one, Marco Sassoli, from the Red Cross. Marco Sassoli makes the point. He says, well, this is a system that might deliver humanitarian outcomes. These machines, if properly calibrated, may in fact comply with the law of armed conflict more faithfully than humans. And he makes this point: a robot cannot hate, cannot fear, it has no survival instinct. While a human often kills to avoid being killed, a robot can wait with the use of force until the last moment, when it is established that the target and the attack are legitimate. I want to test this. I want to test some of these propositions about whether or not a weapons system can in fact comply with the law of armed conflict and preserve humanitarian priorities. I have my doubts, and that's what I'm going to reveal to you tonight. So I'm going to talk in two ways. I'm going to talk about the law of armed conflict and some of the principles and rules that apply to the law of armed conflict that, in my opinion, rely upon an exercise of human judgment, and I'll define what that means, but also have implicit in the law a number of humanitarian underpinnings that I think professionals in this area rely on, that I query whether a machine can emulate. And then in the second part of this presentation, I'm going to talk about law and cognition and argue why I think we need to have moral and ethical agency in our decisions to engage in armed conflict and decisions to exercise force in armed conflict, that again I query whether a machine can properly emulate. So let's talk about some of the basic rules of the law of armed conflict. First one, actually designated as basic rule. That's what it actually says in the Convention of Additional Protocol 1. Article 48 says, parties to a conflict shall at all times distinguish between civilian population and combatants, civilian objects and military objectives, and accordingly shall direct their operations only against military objectives. And then there's a set of further criteria about what would constitute an indiscriminate attack even within these criteria. So you can target combatants, you can target military objectives. You have combatants and civilians. Civilians you obviously can't target, combatants you can. And if you have any doubt about whether someone is a combatant, a member of a military force or not, if you have any doubt, then you can't target. And when I used to train soldiers, sailors and airmen and women, they'd ask me this question: sir, when do I know if I have doubt? I said, once you start asking the question in your own mind, is this person targetable, you have doubt. You don't fire. Very simple test, a very simple test to apply. As in respect of objects, the law as contained here is that an object becomes a military objective which by its nature, location, purpose or use makes an effective contribution to military action and whose total or partial destruction, capture or neutralisation in the circumstances ruling at the time offers a definite military advantage. So these are the principles. In modern times, what we have seen is the rise of non-state actors in armed conflict. So the idea that you have armies marching onto the battlefield and the civilians over the horizon in their homes outside of the battle space is no longer a very contemporary concept. What you have is a lot of non-state actors, civilians who take up arms, are engaging in armed conflict. Now the law says that when a civilian does that, that person loses their protection for such time as they are engaged in that activity. And the Red Cross and other institutions have come up with a series of tests of membership of armed groups and continuous combat function to try and give some life to what this concept means, both in international and non-international armed conflict. I have a query. It is hard enough for military members to make that determination about whether or not a civilian has in fact taken up arms, is in fact a member of an armed group, has in fact a continuous combat function to the point of being targetable. Military members have a hard enough time doing that based on intelligence reports. I query whether a machine would have an advantage. I don't know. The question of doubt. I talk about when you have a doubt about whether or not that person is targetable, that person is not targetable. It answers itself. I wonder how you would program a machine to have that threshold of doubt. Perhaps it could be a very high threshold, a very low threshold. I don't know. The question of nature, location, purpose or use is intrinsically contextual. Whether a bridge or a railway heading or a mountain pass or a particular object here and now is a military objective based on military advantage is very, very contextual. It may now, it may not next week, it may not next month. And that is something that changes, informed by intelligence, informed by battlefield flow. Whether or not a machine would have that ability, you would imagine that they'd have intelligence feeds coming into their programming, but that's something that needs to be perfected in my mind. Another criteria of the law of armed conflict is that you cannot target those who are hors de combat, who are out of the combat. So if you are a combatant and you are wounded and you are out of the conflict, then you may not be targeted. If you are surrendering, you may not be targeted. If you are sick or shipwrecked, you may not be targeted. And it's a critical question whether or not a soldier who is wounded is in or out of the conflict. If the soldier is still engaging in the fight, that soldier, students are often engaging in the fight, that soldier is still targetable. And I query how a machine, what sort of programming would allow a machine to determine whether or not a particular soldier is still engaged in conflict or not. I think that it's a question of judgment, and I think interestingly when you look at research conducted mostly by the police, certainly experienced police, there's a huge role for emotional intelligence in informing decision making as to whether or not a perpetrator is going to engage in violence. That seems to be established as a basic proposition. This nebulous concept of emotional intelligence to determine whether or not that person right now is threatening me to the point where I might use force in response. Not based on a set of objective criteria, but perhaps a more subjective assessment. I'll leave that. I'll come back to that in a minute. Can a system learn under the level 4 NATO designation? The answer is yes, it can, and there is work being done to try and have programs learn to react differently in different situations. And we've seen computers do that. Big Blue now beats everybody in chess. It took some time, but it learned from its mistakes on how to prevail. Can an autonomous weapon do the same? Some who support the introduction of these weapons say yes. Weapons will get better at excluding low probability targets, better at cueing different sensors and applying algorithms to defeat attempts at camouflage. But what of the issue of judgment? What of the issue of subjectivity about whether or not something is targetable or is hors de combat? Again, let me get back to that soon. Another key proposition in the law of armed conflict is proportionality. So it might be all well and good that you have a military objective and you can target it and you can attack it, but there are civilians surrounding that target. The law says that you can still target it provided that the anticipated loss of civilians, the unavoidable, regretful loss of civilians in targeting that military objective are not excessive to the military advantage obtained. So you needed this ratio between military value and incidental loss of life. It's a grave breach if you get it wrong, and it's a standard. It's not a rule. So a rule requires empirical assessment. This is evaluative. How much is that bridge worth? 5 lives, 15, 50, 500? An evaluative process based on considerations of military advantage and very, very context specific. As I say here, a military objective at the beginning of the war may have great value and hence greater loss of civilian life acceptable, but later in the war, when you're winning, that objective may not be worth that many civilians. It's very, very contextual. And you are weighing famously or infamously dissimilar considerations. Human loss versus military advantage. It's not a linear equation traditionally. Again, a qualitative assessment, not a quantitative one, something that computers are really good at, but humans are better, I believe, at, in my submission, qualitative assessments. The other thing is there's this notion, I think, amongst many, that when you are engaged in armed conflict, you arm your militaries to the teeth and you just unleash them. And off they go and they go out and kill the enemy, and it's just how it's done. Perhaps in caveman days. Today, warfare is very bureaucratised. A lot of doctrine, a lot of rules, a lot of process. In any military operation, there is a collateral damage estimate methodology developed for that operation, for that particular context. There are no strike lists. Even though legally possible to strike, there are no strike lists. There's always higher approvals that need to be obtained, or for lawfully targetable objects. A commander's intent weighs heavily how a particular commander wants this operation to proceed. And it may be escalate, all in accordance with the law of armed conflict, de-escalate or remain to the status quo. And there are operational goals that need to be achieved that measure or are related to that escalation, de-escalation. What of geopolitical considerations? And we have that frequently. We might have every right to go into the territorial sea of one nation under a Security Council resolution, but we're just not going to do it because of the actual reality of what that's going to mean. Policy preferences, intelligence updates, status of current operations occurring elsewhere, and of course coalition interoperability. All of this gets factored into the command team decision. And command teams comprise a number of humans, operators, planners, logisticians, medical, legal, etc., to advise the commander on the application of force. Can all this be encapsulated into a machine? Possibly. But I guess what I'm trying to raise is some of the hurdles if we're going to emulate contemporary decision-making in armed conflict that need to be overcome. Let's talk a little bit about judgment. I've said I'm going to come back to it a couple of times. Now is the time I'm going to talk about it. My view, and this is perhaps contentious, my view is participation in armed conflict generates intense emotion and a range of ethical and moral commitments that I believe are unavoidable. You are less than human if you are not affected by such commitments when you deploy, exercise or deploy force. And indeed, in a famous book that came out in 2009 by Dave Grossman, within the context of armed conflict, there is significant empirical evidence that confirms that killing is not an easy thing to do. And this from Chris Coker in a very famous article in the Australian Army Journal. Killing does not seem to come naturally in all situations to all soldiers, even the most highly trained. Natural-born soldiers are not made, they are born, and there are very few of them. This is why the military has preferred the discipline of collective units such as gun crews, which are more easily controlled and which, being often distant from the battlefield, are also less emotionally involved. In a word, they are more mechanical. The greatest cruelties in war have been impersonal ones of remote decision, system and routine. Neurological studies confirm that optimal decision-making involves the exercise of both logic and emotion. Command expectations through all of these criteria that I've been speaking about are nuanced, context specific. And indeed, there is work done in MIT on computer programs. They recognise this. They recognise what optimal decision making requires. Computer programs trying to emulate emotion, giving emotion to computers, this connection of logic and emotion to get what they all accept to be optimal decision making. Also, I would argue that the law, certainly from a humanitarian perspective, relies on human cognition or human psychology. Psychologists tell me, and it's true in my case, and see if it's true in your case, psychologists tell me that we put greater value on loss than on gain. We would prefer not to lose something than to gain something. That works with me, I don't know about you. And so therefore, a test like proportionality is great from a humanitarian perspective. You're weighing up anticipated civilian loss versus military gain. So what they're saying is that works great. If you're wanting a humanitarian priority, that will give it to you. And indeed, from a famous book by Krishnan, one of the greatest restraints for the cruelty in war has always been the natural inhibition of humans not to kill or hurt fellow human beings. The natural inhibition is, in fact, so strong that most people would rather die than kill someone. Taking away the inhibition to kill by using robots for the job could weaken the most powerful psychological and ethical restraint in war. War would be inhumanely efficient and would no longer be constrained by the natural urge of soldiers not to kill. I also offer another observation based on just perhaps my own experience. I think that when you are in armed conflict, this notion of mutuality of risk does actually come to the fore. You know where you are, you know that the enemy is there, and life, in my submission, takes on a greater value. For professional armies, I'm not talking about ISIL or ISIS or terrorist groups that are dedicated to mass murder, but for professional armies, there is a sense of honour that comes from, and I argue, lethal combat, a sense of mutuality of risk which has underpinned conceptions of warfare from Greek times. It heightens the senses, and concepts such as mercy, compassion, forbearance and sympathy are real and are present in that sort of decision making in those heightened circumstances. And indeed, what we're finding with UAV operators in the United States, so UAV operators in the US flying drones, if you like, over Afghanistan. Famous case that was reported in the Atlantic magazine, Marines under fire, Taliban come up, are engaging the Marines. UAV operator sees all this, the Marines can't move, the UAV operator fires the missiles, Taliban killed, vehicle incinerated, victory, everybody's happy, everybody goes home. When asked later how he felt about that, Mark Bowden, the operator, the corporal, said there was this weird feeling. You feel bad. You don't feel worthy. I'm sitting there safe and sound, and those guys down there are in the thick of it, and I can have more impact than they can. It's almost like I don't feel like I deserve to be safe. This feeling of distance that avoids this, what I refer to as this mutuality of risk. So, those are some of my observations. Does the law, can the law nonetheless provide a basis for for autonomous weapon systems? There's a famous study that came out of the International Committee of the Red Cross in 2004. And what it said was, to get compliance with the law, to get everybody complying in the law, we need three things. We need to emphasise the normative quality of the law. We've got to use force to ensure that there's strict compliance. If soldiers get out of line, you've got to bust them back and use strict compliance. And don't worry about persuading them of the values that underpin the law. Just tell them that if they don't comply, then they're going to go to jail. They're going to be dealt with harshly. A very hierarchical command structure is a good thing. Very military-like statement coming out of a body like the Red Cross. I've written an article taking issue with some of this. I'm not convinced that this is in fact the way that you get good compliance in the law of armed conflict, and I think it has particular purchase when you look at autonomous weapon systems. Here's my view. The notion of legal normativity, I think, is overstated. Certainly HLA Hart, legal positivism, the underpinning framework for how we do law in Australia and the UK, I think are overstated. That is, he had three propositions, distinction between primary and secondary rules, semantic certainty, and legal validity does not depend upon any sort of moral inquiry. We all accept that, I suppose, but I think they're overstated. I think that while Marco Sassoli may be right, moral ethical disengagement may reduce violations, no hate or revenge as he says, it also, in my view, systemises the application of bloodshed, industrial warfare. I don't care who you are a target, I'll engage you. That's the counter side of the notion of taking out any sort of moral engagement. And of course, legal neutrality is a highly contested concept. And we can go back to the US realists, we can go legal process, critical legal studies, law and gender, law and history, law and economics, whatever law and you want to pick that takes issue with some of these propositions of Hart. Ronald Dworkin, who I think gets it most right, with his law as integrity concept that talks about a concept of political legitimacy to shape interpretation. Take your pick. There are a number of other competing theories out there about how you interpret or apply the law that are not based on the Hartian propositions. So this notion that we just apply the law and then we can bring in machines that will apply the law has within it some deficiencies in my view. And then, of course, when we get to counterinsurgency, which was occurring in Iraq in the mid-2000s, everything got turned on its head, and we adopted a US realist approach to interpretation. This is not the time or place, and I don't have enough time to get into COIN, but it was a way where law was turned on its head, and all the things that we thought applied on this notion of legal neutrality was applied upside down. So in fact, you had more military members being killed, more civilians being saved, and actually mission success. Another story, another lecture. But the point for this is that it's another way of thinking about the law that can apply successfully that's not anticipated in general concepts. And then within the law of armed conflict, we have things like the Martin's Clause. People ask me, okay, Dale, I get it. You say that you have moral, ethical agency. Well, where is it in the law? Show me where it is in the law. And I'm hard pressed to show it. I can point to the Martin's Clause, this famous clause that says, in the absence of any positive regulation, you rely on the laws of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. That's what you can rely on. And that clause has been marginalised and reduced to almost nothingness. Yes, we all trot it out, but as a basis, as a basis of law, as a basis of decision making under law, it has a very narrow application. But here's the thing. It is a fact in the ADF, at least, that you need moral legitimacy. All the generals get that, and the admirals. And we as a nation got that, certainly post-Vietnam. If you do not have moral legitimacy in fighting a war, then leave. There's no point in fighting. If your public opinion, your opinion of our viewers, if that's not with you, if you have no moral legitimacy, then there is no war to be fought. A very, very key proposition that takes into account considerations other than bare application of the law, and again makes my concern about autonomous weapons more attenuated. And then there's constructivism, this notion that we comply with the law not because that's what we do, because we have to do it, but because we internalise the values. When we internalise the values of the law, we act appropriately. A logic of appropriateness rather than a logic of consequence. Very contentious idea, but one that I believe applies to the ADF, applies to decisions that are made by the ADF. And indeed, this notion of internalisation is seen in a lot of the literature. In 2001, when General Myers, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the US, was told that the Geneva Conventions were not going to apply in Afghanistan, in his biography, he said he reacted forcefully and said, "What? Of course they're going to apply. The Geneva Conventions underpin our own self-image," he said. They are going to apply. They cannot not apply. And indeed, at the height of this argument about whether or not they applied or not, military, in a famous meeting that's got quoted everywhere, a military lawyer stood up and said to the civilian administration, "Who owns the Geneva Conventions? You civilians or us military?" The point being, this notion of internalisation seems to be expressed in a number of different criteria. What's the self-image of an autonomous weapons system? I don't think it has one. I don't think it acts out of any sense of self-image. An issue that I think, again, gives me doubts. And indeed, the Judge Advocate General Corps, during the 2000s, when reacting to a number of administrative US administration propositions about the law, famously reacted. There was an article by Laura Dickinson in the American Journal of International Law that said that one of the bases for that reaction was JAGs protecting the values underpinning that law. So the question is not one of just overt legal compliance, it's one of deeper values that resonate in your interpretation and application of the law. So, in conclusion, autonomous weapon systems can comply with the law. My query is, what is their utility? I can, of course, allow a set of parameters that would allow, if you see a tank in the desert without any civilians, it may be engaged. And if that happens, nobody has any problem with that. That's the law. But what's anticipated is broader than that. And that's where I think we run into trouble. I don't think we're ever likely to have completely autonomous systems. If you read the writing now, every piece of literature still has some idea of human interaction. And to that end, this may just be a completely hypothetical discussion, but who knows? There is certainly an argument, a strong argument made by a number of engineers and roboticists at another tertiary institution in this state that autonomous machines have validity in the context of machine on machine. So if we are attacked, if our country is attacked by swarms of machines from another country, autonomous machines, we might want autonomous machines to react to those machines. Machine on machine, not a problem as a matter of law. But I think what I've tried to reveal tonight is certainly the autonomous weapons debate and my reservations about where this is going. But what I said at the outset, I hope I achieved tonight, and that is in looking at whether or not autonomous weapon systems can comply with the law, we are looking at what is contained within the law and what assumptions we make about the law and what assumptions we make about the exercise of force or the application of violence under that law. And to that end, I think this debate has been quite useful. Thank you very much.